The sun has fallen below the horizon. The stars dot the skies, the crickets sing their song. As the 10 o'clock news draws to a close, you dress in your coziest sleepwear. You turn off your electronics and slide beneath the warm covers of your bed. You take a deep breath and let out a contented sigh. Little do you realize that while you think you are safe in the realm of your dreams, in actuality, you are at your most vulnerable. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. 7, 8, gonna stay up late. 9, 10, never sleep again. Welcome to MonsterClash. Hello, dear viewer. Welcome to my study. I am Stephen Romney, cinematic scholar and your host for this evening. And this is MonsterClash, the show where we take two versions of the same classic horror story and pit them together to determine which is superior. And for tonight's offering, we are taking a look at one of the most iconic horror villains, a man who can stand on the same pedestal as Frankenstein's monster, Count Dracula, the fallen priest Imhotep, and even the Wolfman. Yes, we are talking about one Fred Krueger. Representing the old, we have the 1984 classic slasher film, A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Wes Craven. And representing the new, we have the 2010 remake, directed by Samuel Bayer. Let's not waste any more time and begin with round one. The original is one of those prototypical 80s slashers films. Its story is very simple, but it pulls you in with a sense of mystery and suspense. While it's relatively short, it moves at a slow pace that builds atmosphere and allows for frequent misdirection. As Freddy claims more and more victims, we see the mental and physical toll the ordeal begins to take on our main heroine Nancy and the people around her, as it pushes her mother further towards alcoholism and her friends are killed one by one. The lines between dream and reality blur frequently, as they would if we were the ones deprived of sleep. This forces our heroine to be as crafty as possible in efforts to uncover the mystery of Fred Krueger, a serial child killer that her mother and the other parents trapped inside a burning building after they were denied justice by means of a legal technicality. We don't actually see it, but the moment where Nancy's mother reveals this is especially haunting, like you're seeing a rare moment of clarity from someone who's constantly trying to escape from reality through alcohol. What really drives this story forward is Nancy's resourcefulness, particularly after she learns that she is able to pull Freddy into the real world, and endeavors to end the nightmare once and for all, which we, as the audience, assume she does by the film's end. We're made to think that the whole thing was one larger nightmare she was having over the course of one night. However, whether it be a cruel twist of fate, or simply the power of the antagonist, we realize that she was never able to escape him, and that he cannot be defeated. Yes, a good 30 years before Christopher Nolan, we were already made to question what was the dream and what was reality, with many questions unanswered and the fate of our protagonist left uncertain. The remake, on the other hand, falters in oh so many ways. Firstly, it expects the viewer to already be familiar with the character of Freddy Krueger, which negates the fun of watching the main characters unravel the mystery. Secondly, it commits the most common of sins that horror remakes commit, and that is going into explicit detail about the origins of the main antagonist. While the original stated that Freddy was a serial child killer who continued to kill from beyond the grave, here they turn him into a child molester that is specifically targeting his former victims in a twisted form of revenge. This leads to what is probably the biggest plot hole in the entire film, and that is the fact that all of the victims went to the same preschool, and yet all of the parents made a conscious effort to suppress those memories. I understand if one character repressed those memories, but you expect me to believe that an entire town conspired to bury the memories of what the children went through, all without thinking of the possible repercussions? What's worse is that in this version, Freddy never went to trial. In fact, the parents specifically killed Freddy so that they didn't have to go to trial. This in turn makes their motivations a great deal more selfish and just nonsensical. This film tries to build up the possibility that Freddy may have been an innocent man when he died, which would have made some of his dialogue choices make more sense if they actually followed through with it, as he keeps repeating to his victims that he is real. Instead, it was used as a paper-thin excuse to lead the two remaining main characters to the now abandoned preschool, which you think would have been torn down if the parents really wanted their children to forget about its existence. As for our characters, we see some resourcefulness, but not to the degree we see in the original. In fact, it's more through sheer dumb luck that they appear to defeat Freddy, through a fight scene that really breaks the suspension of disbelief when you realize that a blade from a paper cutter is not sharp enough to actually decapitate someone, especially when you consider that it's been exposed to the elements for a good number of years without ever being sharpened or maintained. Simply put, it is not a machete. While the remake did introduce some creative scenarios that could work in an Elm Street movie, there are just way too many problems with the story. The fact that it tries to spell out and show us the origin of Freddy takes away a good chunk of the mystery, and the big coincidence that's supposed to tie everything together is probably the worst aspect of the story. There hasn't been an easier round to decide here on MonsterClash, and this is mainly by virtue of which film had fewer problems. The remake makes several pointless additions to the story of the original to the point that it gets out of control. The original, on the other hand, is much tighter, much more focused, and just has a better pace overall. As such, this round goes to the old. While much of Craven's film is grounded in a contemporary aesthetic, its most unique aspect is the twisting of reality, as it makes effective use of the kind of imagery one would see in dreams, such as the exaggeration of scale when Nancy is pulled in the bathtub. It also slowly pulls the viewer into the dream, often leading you to think that the character is still awake until something breaks the rules of reality, which is akin to what happens when someone lucid dreams for the first time. This is an aspect that's alluded to during this famous shot as we see Freddy beginning to terrorize Nancy. Lastly, the film's vibrant colors create an interesting starting point, as it makes Freddy the main thing that stands out early on, indicating that he is the invader in an otherwise normal dream world. However, as the film continues and as the body count piles up, the art direction becomes more twisted, as we see more and more surreal imagery, leading to the climactic showdown between Nancy and Freddy at the end of the film as Freddy loses his powers and disappears. It's those moments and visual cues that make the film as a whole have such an impact. It employs subtlety and slowly builds up its terror. The remake, unfortunately, suffers from a problem a lot of films from the past few years seem to be suffering from, and that's the lack of any thought being put into the imagery to reinforce the narrative. The film copies many iconic moments from the original, but then makes them too over the top, robbing those moments of any subtlety. While the scene where Nancy is succumbing to micronaps is pretty interesting to look at, moments like that are pretty few and far between. The film is too overt when we transition into the dream world, as it occurs very abruptly and often at predictable times. What also hurts it is the film's overall lack of color or vibrancy. While there are color schemes to certain scenes, they don't really go beyond having either a cool color scheme or a warm color scheme. Even Freddy's iconic striped sweatshirt just seems to blend into the scenery around it. Once again, it's easy to see who the clear victor is. The original just had more thought and more imagination put into its visuals, whereas the remake is an imperfect copy that is trying to appeal to audience nostalgia using the lifted imagery without understanding what made those images work in the first place. As such, this round goes to the old. For tonight's final round, we will be taking a look at the monster himself, the hypnagogic hellion who stalks his slumbering prey and drives them to the brink of insomniac insanity before cutting them down with his trademark bladed glove. Robert Englund's version of Freddy is a sadist who thrives not only on killing his victims, but specifically frightening them. That is why, in the dream world, he will frequently cut himself apart to reveal maggots and oozing pus, as well as manipulating the dream world to lull his victims into a false sense of security before he jumps out at them. He relishes in his victims' suffering, but it never goes beyond simple terror. He's not motivated by any overarching personal reasons, he's just out to kill, and he loves it. To him, the fact that the victims are the children of the people who killed him in the first place just seems to be icing on the cake. While the remake is rife with problems, casting Jackie Earle Haley as Freddy was probably the best decision they made. He understands that Freddy is a sadistic psychopath and is able to channel that perfectly. That said, a lot of what holds him back is the writing and lackluster atmosphere. We only really see the actual joy he has in killing his victims in one brief exchange with one of the victims, but other than that, he's a little too underplayed. What also hurts is that a lot of Freddy's dialogue is a little too rapey. This is an idea that could work with a different sort of villain that was specifically a sexual predator. I mention this because Freddy's dialogue doesn't seem to quite match up with his methodology. He has the mind of one type of criminal, but the modus operandi of a completely different criminal. In the original, Freddy was a serial killer in both life and death, which is why his methods make more sense. The glove was his signature, his weapon of choice, so it makes sense that he would still use it when killing from beyond the grave. Here, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. They say that the glove came from the tools he used as a gardener for the preschool, but the methodology just doesn't feel like the logical extreme it would go to. If they were to do another Nightmare on Elm Street, one that would be closer to Wes Craven's original vision, then Haley would be a good choice for the role. But with the remake, the writing is his biggest handicap here. As such, when it comes to Freddy Krueger, there can be only one. This round goes to the old. This was probably the easiest clash to preside over, because while remakes in past episodes of the show had some merit to them, something that allowed them to hold their own in some capacity when compared to their original counterpart, this film just wasn't that good. They tried to mimic the original without really understanding what made the original so good or what made a lot of the imagery really work. Not to mention that they commit the cardinal sin of going into too much detail about the villain's backstory. What makes a lot of these characters scary is what we don't know about them, because when we don't know enough about them, they seem less human and are therefore more inherently terrifying. And really, we did not need an origin story. We got an origin story in the original. And the way we got it in the original was just more haunting and more eerie because we're not seeing it. We're hearing it from someone who killed him. And even then, it takes on a more mythic quality because you see just how far-reaching his presence is, even beyond just the victims that he's terrorizing. And you just feel his presence, even though he is not in the scene. And so, really, there's no ideal version that would take ideas from the remake and mix them with the old and we'll have the perfect movie. No. There is the ideal movie. We already have the ideal movie. The 1984 version by Wes Craven, the superior film. Now, it would be remiss of me to not address the fact that 2 months prior to the upload of this video, we lost the master of horror himself, Wes Craven. And as someone who's only recently begun to appreciate horror films as a genre, I feel that his biggest strength was striking that balance when it came to his villains between being human and inhuman. You could converse with his monsters, but they were never too sympathetic, nor could you really connect with them on any deep level, and that's what made them inherently more terrifying. And I also like the fact that he was not above commenting on some of the more overused tropes of the genre, as seen with films like Scream. He understood what made horror films work on a fundamental level, so that even when his films weren't the greatest in the world, they were still entertaining to watch. He truly was a master of his craft. This Halloween, I ask all of you to join me in raising a glass in honor of this master of horror. Thank you for all the nightmares, Wes Craven. May your legacy live on for many years to come. This brings this episode of MonsterClash to a close. However, we are not done yet. Join me next time as we leave behind the terrifying realms of nightmares and enter the equally terrifying realm of high school. But for now, good night, dear viewer. Good night.